Hello, and welcome back. In part 4 of this 7-part series, we examine sexual asymmetries and sex as a service from a perspective that can be loosely termed anthropological. The preamble to Bill C-36 notes the gendered aspect of sex work, and on this basis, it articulates a concern for the implications for equality in our society of sex work. Of course, it is undeniably true that paid sexual services are predominantly gendered and consist overwhelmingly of men being served primarily by women. And so it's certainly worth having the conversation about why this is the case. And that's where we're heading in this segment. This is a difficult issue to broach, but it's unavoidable if we want to understand the full context for sex as a female service. So I'm going to plunge ahead carefully. I'll devote a lot of time to presenting the structure of the argument and then stepping through that systematically, organizing the evidence that I have. I'm going to warn you up front that these are highly emotional issues, especially for many women. Several articles I've read on these themes in the New York Times during the past 2 or 3 years have attracted hundreds of often outraged responses from female readers. For many of them, the content of the comments indicate that the mere broaching of these themes is extremely difficult to abide, let alone the news content of these articles, which have generally synthesized recent research findings. This is going to be by far the longest and the most technical of the segments, because there's a lot of ground to cover, and we need to do so in depth because of the high burden of proof and because it requires illustrations in order to convey successfully. I suspect that there will be many, both men and women, particularly mature men and women, by which I mean older, who will take one look at the logical structure of the argument and say, of course, this is belaboring the intuitively obvious. And if that's your reaction, feel free to skip directly to part 5 and have a nice day. However, I believe that there are others for whom these arguments will present novel considerations, seldom heard in these times, and it is for these folks that we need to proceed carefully in this segment. I hope you'll agree in any case that, despite its complexity, this is important and fascinating material that is well grounded in straightforward scientific evidence, and also that this is a conversation we absolutely need to have in the current political context. So let's start with a quick summary of what we'll deal with in this segment. Paid sexual services do have an undeniably gendered aspect in that women primarily serve and are paid by men. In this segment, we're going to look closely at why that's the case. Anthropologists and others have identified common patterns in the gender-related economics of heterosexual sex across widely disparate cultures. Women have been shown to be more selective than men in choosing partners for sex, and therefore to be more motivated by incidental benefits beyond the physical act. Economically speaking, sex can be usefully analyzed as an act of service in a wide variety of contexts, above and beyond explicitly paid sexual services. And finally, the transfer of resources, being gifts, money, unrelated favors, or time, from men to women, is commonly associated with sexual relations, making sex work of women for men a diffuse category and a ubiquitous human phenomenon. The core argument has 2 major parts. First, there's a partial mismatch in the sexual quests, if we can call it that, of men and women. And second, this commonly leads, under a wide variety of circumstances, to extrinsic considerations being of the essence to sexual relations. And by extrinsic, we mean separate from the sensual and bodily pleasures and health benefits of sex. So under the first of these, Part A, there are three major suppositions. First of all, gender sexual interest gaps are marked and they grow with age. Second, men's erotic interest in women is more broadly directed than the reverse. And third, a corollary of the second, many men excite no purely erotic, immediate interest in the average woman. The second major part, Part B, also has three suppositions. The first is that men commonly present side payments to women for sex. Secondly, current campus sex patterns, that is, on university campuses, are an explainable anomaly. And third, much less heterosexual sex would occur in the absence of all side payments. We'll focus first on the point that gender sexual interest gaps are marked and they grow with age. Here are the results from a large survey that was conducted in 1995 and 1996 and reported out in the case of the scientific paper that is the source for this table in the British Medical Journal in 2010. And what it does is compare a number of characteristics of sexuality between men and women across three age groups. The first of which is quite broad, it's from 25 to 54. If we focus in on interest in sex, what we find is, most notably in the younger age bracket, that among those not living with a partner, there's about a 12 percentage point gap between men and women. Or put differently, for every 4 women not living with a partner in that younger age range who are interested in sex, there are about 5 men interested in sex. As folks get older, the gap only grows. And so in the middle age range of 55 to 64, what you see is a gap that among those not living with a partner, whereby about half of men have an interest in sex at that age, and only 24% of women of the same age, same relationship status, have a similar interest. And so in a population in which there are roughly equal numbers of men and women in that same age range, among those not living with a partner, there are more than 2 men interested in sex for every 1 woman interested in sex. Now, this data is reporting out on what are quite large age categories. And it's important to keep in mind that in reality, the changes are not as abrupt as they're shown in this step-down pattern that we see for both genders, but especially for women, that they are rather, in all likelihood, gradual changes, and that in intermediary age groups, such as, for example, 40 to 54, you would likely see very significant gaps that are somewhere between the gap that you see for the 25 to 54, which again was about 12 points for the not living with a partner, through the gap of 26 points for the 55 through 64. Now, interest in sex, which was the measure on the previous slide, is a pretty blunt measure. It doesn't really get to how interested, or what's the depth of interest, what's the level of investment in sexuality and in daily life by men and women. So to begin to get to those points, I actually obtained and crunched some data from a very large US study that was conducted in 1992 called the National Health and Social Life Survey. And I've included the item codes from the items that are discussed on this slide. So if you, for example, look at one of the survey questions, how often does the respondent think about sex, and focus on the ones that respond every day or several times a day, the men in that sample, about 53% of them agreed with those categories, but only about 19% of women. In terms of masturbation frequency, about a quarter of men responded that they were doing that at least once a week, as opposed to 7% of women. In terms of kind of visual response to visual stimuli, or perhaps in terms of the level of attraction found to one's own partner, the percentage of the respondents responding that they found it, quote, very appealing to watch their partner undress was about 47% for men, 27% for women, quite a significant gap. At the same time, it's important to emphasize from these results that it's not that women are repulsed by the thought of heterosexual sex in the abstract. If you look at the last item here, it's impressive that their numbers are high and they're within a hair's breadth of men's. And so we can certainly see from this data that the vast majority of women do have heterosexual inclinations. And I say this primarily to men, it is important not to overinterpret the data on this page. Obviously, women are sexual creatures with genuine needs. It's just that on average, their sex drive is calibrated in such a way as to be primed by the various forms of resource transfers that we'll deal with in this segment. As we'll see in the next slide, nature appears to have left many women with some degree of sexual ambivalence, even, or perhaps especially, with their long-term partners. It's as if nature has positioned them right at the edge of interest, such that in many situations they could go either way. It's like, make me an interesting proposition, show me what you can offer. The old Spanish expression has it, el hombre propone y la mujer dispone. The man proposes and the woman decides. Dietrich Klusman published a study in June 2002 in the Archives of Sexual Behavior that drew on a sample of more than 1,800 German students aged 19 through 32. He was interested in looking at changes in interest in sex through the duration of a partnership, that is, in a relationship. And here you see one of his primary findings. If you focus on the item wants to have sex often, both men and women start near the beginning of a relationship at around the 3/4 mark. But by 8 years later, while men have sustained or indeed even slightly increased their level of interest, the comparable level of interest has fallen among women to around the 25 or 30% mark. Although we try very hard as a society not to talk about it much, data shows that about 1/3 of women suffer or manifest a lack of sexual interest. If we measure that item by whether a woman says she lacked sexual interest for at least several months of the past year, roughly 1/3 of women across the age ranges from 18 through 59 would endorse that statement. In comparison, about 16% of men in the same underlying study lacked an interest in sex by the same measure. Interestingly, it turns out that having a husband for sex diminishes the lack of sexual interest among women only to a very limited degree. So on the same item, same survey as the previous slide, those who are currently married, about 30% or so lack sexual interest. And that compares with about 37% of those never married and about 38% of those who are currently divorced. The popular media has reported widely on several of these results. For example, there was an article published in the New York Times in December 2012 by Sonia Lubomirsky, and who is a full professor of psychology at the University of California, Riverside, and holds a PhD from Stanford University. She said, and I quote, "Sexual passion and arousal are particularly prone to hedonic adaptation. Studies show that in long-term relationships, women are more likely than men to lose interest in sex and to lose it sooner. Why? Because women's idea of passionate sex depends far more centrally on novelty than does men's." The reduced erotic appeal of well-established relationships is sufficiently familiar to women to be a staple of comedy. If we sneak a peek into Cosmopolitan magazine, which I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that I did as part of the research for this presentation, we find quite a humorous piece that appeared in June 2014. And I quote, "Marriage is amazing. It's like living with your best friend, someone you sleep with, laugh with, cry with. But you know what's hotter than having sex with your best friend for eternity? Everything. For many women, the ones who aren't liars, it's work to stay sexually stimulated by a partner who's returning our calls." The evidence and the anecdotes that we've reviewed in the last 7 slides have all related to the supposition that gender sexual interest gaps are significant and they only get bigger with age, and as we've seen with the duration of relationships. Let's now turn to our second supposition, which again is that men's erotic interest in women is more broadly directed than the reverse. Donald Simons, who remains a professor emeritus in the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, published in 1979 a study of human sexuality from an evolutionary perspective. Now, reading straight from Wikipedia, Harvard psychologist and New York Times bestselling author Steven Pinker describes Simons' 1979 work, The Evolution of Human Sexuality, as, quote, "a groundbreaking book," and, quote, "a landmark in its synthesis of evolutionary biology, anthropology, physiology, psychology, fiction, and cultural analysis, written with a combination of rigor and wit. It was a model for all subsequent books that apply evolution to human affairs, particularly mind," end quote. We are going to rely repeatedly in this segment upon this classic landmark work for the strength of the synthesis and the trenchant insights that it presents. And we're going to begin our review of this work with one of the most basic and important insights that Simons offers, and I quote, "The ultimate reproductive fact that males stand to benefit from copulating with any fertile female if the risk is low enough, whereas females do not stand to benefit from copulating with many males, no matter how low the risk, is most directly expressed in the proximate psychological fact that the typical male is at least slightly sexually attracted to most females, whereas the typical female is not sexually attracted to most males." One straightforward consequence from that observation is that women's reproductive success, in terms of the number of children they have, is more uniform than men's. So in most societies, under most ecological conditions, men have had greater variability than women in their reproductive and presumably mating successes. Statistically, this is borne out in the following compendium of research results that appeared in a study published in Trends in Ecology and Evolution in 2009 in an article entitled "Bateman's Principles in Human Sex Roles." And what the results from this meta-analysis gathered here show is that the variance in the count of men's children exceeds that of women in the great majority of cases outside the frigid north. Another way of summarizing the results on the previous slide is to say that the filter that women apply in deciding with which men to mate is stronger on average than the filter men use to decide with which women to mate. But that begs the question, well, what goes into that filter? And from the literature, not surprisingly, from an intuitive standpoint, it appears that men's resources influence their success with women. A study was done of nearly 10 million census records dating from a relatively recent period, from the year 2000 or later, in 6 countries: Brazil, Mexico, Panama, South Africa, the United States, and Venezuela. And what it found across that range of countries is that the highest income men had the highest proportion of ever married and the lowest proportion of childlessness. The study concluded, and I quote, "A lower percentage of low-income men are selected by females because for women, male status and resources provided by men are important criteria in mate selection." More specifically, within the realm of casual sex, women's erotic fascination with off-the-charts men is evident from female porn fiction. I'll let you read this piece yourself. I'm not sure I could keep a straight face, but let's say that it doesn't take many words and sentences in female erotic literature to establish a character as immediately interesting to women in a certain way. A few palm trees, ocean waves, and possession of a secluded mansion in Malibu are pretty much all it takes. Now let's remind ourselves that our intended context here is casual sex, hence purely erotic immediate interest. In the previous section, we looked briefly at some data concerning long-term relationships, but only as a proxy in order to speak to the distribution of interest among women and men. Now let's turn to our third supposition, that many men excite no purely erotic immediate interest in the average woman. And as we look at this question, we'll be in a position to focus much more directly on casual sex. In his famous 1979 work, Donald Simons conceptualized the sexual attractiveness of men and women in terms of a wider and a narrower bell-shaped distribution. Along with this famous chart, he provided the following analysis, and I quote, "As one moves down the attractiveness scale," and incidentally that would imply in this chart moving from the right towards the left, "female sexual interest in males drops off much faster than male sexual interest in females does. An individual experiences an immediate, purely sexual attraction only to those members of the opposite sex who fall to the right of or at the same point as him or herself. Consequently, an individual at any point on the scale considers him or herself to be granting the favor if he or she copulates with any individual of the other sex to the left of that point. Favorless, purely sexual encounters occur only between individuals at the same point on the scale." Now, as you study and reflect on the proposition here, you'll note that Simons argues with this classic analysis that for the great majority of men in the flatter instance of the bell curve, there are few women to be found to the left. And so the vast majority of their sexual encounters involve, on Simon's reckoning, the provision of favors. This is a really fundamental postulate or hypothesis. By the same token, it's crucial to emphasize that the women in the narrower, pointy bell curve on the right-hand side are not, for the most part, permanent celibates. It's not that they stand there and scoff at any and all men who should pass their way. If they are single, heterosexual, and in the right mood or in the right social context, they may well take a genuine interest in what you have to offer, perhaps even if you fall significantly to the left of them within the male flatter curve. Look at it from their perspective. It is slim pickings out there on the right. If you draw a vertical line anywhere on the right-hand side of this chart and compare the height of the condensed female curve with the underlying male curve, there are only so many millionaire male Calvin Klein underwear models to go around. So the women are certainly apt to look further afield to their left and consider their options. And they may well want to hear your offer from out there in left field, so to speak, so long as that offer is not free, no strings attached sex. That proposition may not be of interest to them unless you are truly one of the few fortunate men to be positioned on the right-hand tail of the male population. For example, that well-endowed chap with the modernist mansion on the beach in Malibu from 2 slides ago. So if not no strings attached sex, then what? Obviously, apart from quickly sizing you up in the order of things, a woman will, in the female parlance, be looking for signs of maturity, thoughtfulness, supportiveness, and dedication. Or, in our somewhat less romantic economic lingo, your enthusiastic willingness to provide a substantial stream of side payments of various resources, now and in perpetuity, without which there can be no deal. So again, we make the point that it is not that women are asexual, it's just that they are most commonly, with most prospective partners, especially impressed by package deals that include but are not limited to sex alone. A current cultural gloss painted over this timeless story updates it with contemporary nomenclature. Turning to Rosen's book, The End of Men, and I quote, "In a world where women are better educated than men and out-earning them in their 20s, dating becomes complicated. Men are divided into what the college girls call the players, a smaller group, and the losers, a much larger group, and the women are left fighting for small spoils. The players are in high demand and hard to pin down. The losers are not all that enticing." Rosen can be a little harsh, or perhaps brutally honest, in her appraisal of the prospects in modern American society of young men, and this quotation certainly reflects that. However, bear in mind that she's speaking in the context of the hookup-centric holding pattern of non-relationships within which many 20-somethings are immersed today. Clearly, once the so-called losers mature into men of substance, they will of course be able to offer much more to the women they will then find in their midst. In seeking long-term relationships, individuals do consider broader bundles of characteristics in a prospective mate, everything they've gotten to know about you over time. A New York Times article that referenced several recent scientific papers summarized this research, and I quote, "Mate value is predicated on people's ability to reach some degree of consensus about one another's desirable qualities. Psychological research on first impressions has shown that men and women do in fact reach some degree of consensus about each other in precisely this way. Yet alongside this consensus is an equally important concept, uniqueness. It seems most likely that it is the consensually desirable people who pull off the rare feat of quickly leveraging an initial positive impression into romance. But as people get to know each other, decreasing consensus and increasing uniqueness give everyone a fighting chance." So all this is extremely good news for men and women who seek something longer term with folks that will have a chance to get to know them. There's just one little problem. For better or for worse, much of our sexuality today is focused on short-lived liaisons and casual encounters in which the unique qualities that we all bring have less time to differentiate individuals. And we see the consequences of that in terms of one measure of success of men with women. A recent informal survey testifies to the concentration of female erotic interest in a minority of men. The survey was conducted by Helen Smith for her book Men on Strike, which was published in 2013. And what her data would suggest is that a small proportion of men rank highly enough to provide the great majority of novel sexual encounters to women, who in some cases are stretching these alpha men quite thinly. And I quote, "The 80-20 rule is largely substantiated. The 28 most sexually successful men," that's in her sample, "had sex with 1,099 of the 1,447 women, or 76%. So, in the interest of precision, it should probably henceforth be described as the 75-20 rule, wherein 20% of the men are having 75% of the sexual encounters. Monetary success does tend to correlate with sexual success for men. The average income of the 28 alphas, that's a category she's applied, who had an average age of 38, was 50% higher than the average at $112,000. The average income of the male virgins, whose average age was 31, was 16% lower than the norm, at $63,000. Although men as individuals, whatever their station in life, should be fully cognizant of opportunities to better themselves, to be able to offer or pay more, there's no use trying to sugarcoat the sharp inequalities in the distribution of opportunities among men as a group for novel sexual encounters. George Orwell put it well, and rather poignantly. The observation is that at the lower extreme end of the social scale, men excite no interest in women. As discussed and quoted by Simons in the work that we've already been discussing at length, quote, "Below a certain level," Orwell points out, "society is entirely male, and because tramps, we prefer to call them homeless people, generally do not have even enough money for food, they are almost entirely cut off from women." Now quoting Orwell directly, "The result for a tramp is that he is condemned to perpetual celibacy. For of course it goes without saying that if a tramp finds no women at his own level, those above, even a very little above, are as far out of his reach as the moon. Women never, or hardly ever, condescend to men who are much poorer than themselves. A tramp, therefore, is absolutely without hope of getting a wife, a mistress, or any kind of woman." Through the last 5 slides, we've dealt with the supposition in terms of theory, in terms of some data, and in terms of a cultural illustration or two, that many men excite no purely erotic, immediate interest in the average woman. And with that, we rest our case, as it were, for the first major point in this segment, that men and women are partially mismatched in their sexual quests in this world. And so we now turn to our second major argument in this segment, namely that extrinsic considerations are often integral or of the essence to sex, beginning with the supposition that men commonly present side payments to women for sex. In choosing to have sex, women's principal motivations often comprise more than carnal desire. In the same large 1992 study, upon which we've relied several times in this segment, respondents were asked about their reasons for the last time they had sex, and they could endorse as many of the reasons as applied. When asked whether those reasons included to relieve sexual tension or arousal, we would say because they were horny. About 37% of women said no, that wasn't one of the reasons. And of those that had responded that sexual tension or arousal was not one of the reasons they had sex, about half of them gave a yes response to the item because your partner wanted you to. The ambivalence to sex that some women feel sometimes is something that many men try hard to overcome. For example, the financial cost of establishing intimacy with a woman remains largely borne by men, even in modern Western society. A recent study found that, according to men, 87% of them, according to women, 57% of men pay for most expenses, even after dating for a while. 44% of women indicated that they are, quote, bothered when men expected them to pay. Another previous study, based on data collected between 2005 and 2011, found that men were some 30 times more likely to pay, at 63%, than the women, at 2%, on the most recent date, which arguably is a better framed and more specific question. On 19% of dates, both paid, and some dates incurred no financial costs. Perhaps this is nothing new. The anthropological evidence is that our hunting and gathering forebears often had sexual cultures in which meat hunted by men was bartered for sex offered by women. Donald Simons quotes the field observations of an earlier anthropologist who noted, quote, gift-giving or even cash payment for sexual intercourse cannot be used as a criteria to define prostitution, for these occur in courtship or even marital situations, end quote. That on the basis of observations of wedding night behavior within a specific South African traditional society. In an age of joint bank accounts, sexual behavior in long-term relationships does not generally hinge so immediately upon cash. However, research shows that an emotional nexus persists that connects favors in sex, even in contemporary established relationships. An article in the journal Personal Relationships was published in 2010 entitled, "It's the Little Things, Everyday Gratitude as a Booster Shot for Romantic Relationships." The article observes that researchers distinguish between communal and exchange-based relationships. In romantic communal relationships, the aspect of exchange, implying reciprocity, indebtedness, and repayment, is often emotionally repressed and channeled instead into feelings of gratitude. Nevertheless, there remains a powerful indirect linkage between a stream of resource transfers, subjectively experienced as beneficial, thoughtful behaviors, and sex. The linkage, according to the study, is that perceived favors are met with a response of gratitude on the part of the recipient, and in turn with an improved perception of relationship connection. According to other research, improvements in this connection lead on average to more sex. Summarized on this slide is another study. This one is very interesting because it argues for the importance of quote-unquote sexual scripts above and beyond exchange to healthy and rich sexual lives between domestic partners. This study made the headlines when it came out, and you might remember hearing about it because it showed that men performing core housework were actually less likely to enjoy higher sexual frequency. At first glance, this result runs against the grain of my argument here because it points out the limits of an exchange model within long-term communal relationships. However, there are two additional points that are important to make. First, there is a certain type of domestic work that men perform that does increase sexual frequency. Specifically, work that is labeled in the study as non-core, which tends to be outside the home. It's outdoor work, doing auto maintenance, driving, also paying bills. And secondly, it's not actually inconsistent with the anthropological results. In fact, Simons, in the work I'm quoting extensively from here, notes from cited ethnographic studies that hunting and gathering men who were poor hunters were not able to make up for that deficiency by investing in home-centric work, such as, quote, planting more crops and collecting more forest products than anyone else and trading vegetables for meat, unquote. Or in a separate case from a different study that he cites, by, quote, working hard at gardening, canoe making, fishing, and various household tasks, end quote. Overall, it seems that what drives establishing and maintaining sexual access for men in long-term relationships are A, economic resources won from outside, B, errands and outdoor work, and C, the ad hoc, responsive, valuable favors that are so important for earning women's gratitude and maintaining relationship connection, as we discussed in the previous slide. All of these are obviously instances of resource transfers, and so our overall point certainly survives the evidence from the fascinating study reviewed on this page. One of the most important results that I've encountered in the course of doing the research for this series is cited in Hannah Rosen's recent book concerning women's new independence, titled The End of Men. What is found is that even winning a very small prize of $25,000 to $50,000, female winners were subsequently much less likely to marry. This is an extremely interesting result because it helps to explain why we are seeing so much lower rates of marriage and higher rates of living solo in contemporary society. Professional women are, of course, metaphorically speaking, economically winning the lottery every year. They are much more likely to be financially independent and not to find the prospective resource transfers on offer from the men they find in their midst to be particularly important. Absent this lottery result, one might have assumed that the explanation for lower rates of marriage among modern women was a lack of time and energy left over from their careers. But this seems discounted here. It's also interesting that the male winners were not at all deterred by their windfalls in getting married. The second study referenced here is Stephanie Kuntz's outstanding survey of the numerous historical transformations of marriage through recent centuries to the present. In this study, she corroborates the evidence that women, now much more economically independent in their 20s, are playing a much more patient game and are doing much more due diligence in assessing the prospective financial contributions from their partners. And I quote, "In the 1950s and 1960s, young men and women thought that marriage was the way people settled down and made relationships work. Today, most young people see marriage as something you do only when you're already sure your partner has settled down and the relationship is working." As women are emancipated and find true callings as professionals, or even simply come to receive independent sources of state financial support, the bar is clearly rising for what level of resource contributions are sufficient to present oneself as a suitable mate. Kuntz tells an anecdote from a conversation she has with a U.S. woman, and I quote, "Many women today see no point in marrying unless their prospective husband has both the economic prospects and the emotional dependability to make pooling their resources worthwhile. I don't need a husband to help me scrape by," a welfare recipient told me. "I can scrape by on my own. Find me a man who's got a steady job and a mortgage and no jail time in his past, and I'll marry him pretty damn quick." Perhaps it goes without saying that there is very little call for the male equivalent to the old model of the kept woman. Rosen in The End of Men quotes Beverly, an African-American executive, who says, quote, "Women should be very careful about marrying freeloading, blood-sucking parasites," end quote. For the past 8 slides, we've been discussing how extrinsic considerations are often integral, often of the essence, to heterosexual sex. One contemporary phenomenon that might be considered to run against that theme is the existence of the hookup culture on university campuses today. So this needs at least brief discussion. Sex on campus is nothing new. Just ask anyone who came of age in the 1970s. But what we've been seeing and hearing about for 10 or 15 years now is a culture in which casual or recreational sex has gained in salience on many campuses relative to sex within a loving, stable relationship. Hannah Rosen deals with this topic in considerable detail, and she argues that this is all good from the standpoint of the core educational and professional aspirations of young women. However, one is nevertheless struck from our perspective at the lack of apparent male favors and resource transfers. Young men in this context are having sex left, right, and center, and there's little evidence that they're doing much of anything to earn that. On the contrary, it would appear that young women are putting themselves out, in some cases at the edge of their comfort zones, in order to be more appealing to and win the interest of male lovers. Check out these field notes from the front line, written by a recent Harvard graduate. She provides a detailed and credible account of the lengths to which young, socially desirable women are going to couple with young men. The author is very perceptive, and she herself captures a likely explanation for the phenomena she describes. And her account turns out to be absolutely aligned with the classical theory, as well as with contemporary academic analysis. Back to Simons and then to Rosen once more. Rosen observes, quote, "It's no accident that the Girls Gone Wild culture rose up at the same time women started to dominate college campuses. What gives it a grand scale is the chronic oversupply problem. In societies with more women, men become promiscuous. In our society overall, we don't have more women than men, but in certain segments it plays out that way. The average state school, the rising middle class. So in rare instances, such as modern universities with wildly lopsided sex ratios, or post-war societies in which a great many of the men have been killed off, more sex will undoubtedly be favorless. As a sidebar, there's one study that I encountered and would like to mention and suggest should be severely discounted. This is a widely cited meta-analysis published in 2010 in the Psychological Bulletin, and it suggests that men and women are more similar than commonly supposed. It presents a couple of arguments. One is that gender differences were found to be typically small in the incidence of sexual behaviors such as giving or receiving oral sex and using condoms, and that there is a broad similarity now in men and women's attitudes concerning the ethics of having sex, including before marriage. The study did confirm residual gender differences in permissive attitudes to casual sex, despite the use of a statistical criterion that is biased to the proposed similarity hypothesis. There are a couple of severe shortcomings in this study. First, in interpreting the data, the authors make one of the most common rookie mistakes by concluding in their commentaries that differences in attitudes are absent. But in truth, absence of statistical significance is not proof positive of the absence of a real relationship. As an example, if you're to go out and do a study tomorrow with very small dual samples, you might well fail to detect statistically significant differences between the samples, even those that are in fact strong and robust, even those that have been deliberately introduced into the samples for demonstration purposes. And that's because statistical significance is dependent on the sample sizes, the extent of the difference, and the relative frequencies. And that's just stats 101, or maybe 201. But that problem with the analysis is just nitpicking compared to the massive conceptual problem in this research. Evolution is not a theory that concerns whether or not women and men, at the end of the day, choose to have sex together. Evolutionary theory predicts gender differences not in the incidence and culture of heterosexual sex and all its variations between men and women, but rather in the motivations, the gendered variance in mating and reproductive success, and gendered relative scarcity of casual sex partners and associated economics. If the authors of this study wish to challenge the consensus concerning the salience of gender in human sexuality, that's great. But they really need to go back and read their Simons, the classic theoretical source we've used heavily for this segment, so they have a clear idea what they are responding to. Even as a non-specialist, non-academic, I'm surprised that this piece got through in its published form. All we can speculate is that it must have been a busy period for the anonymous reviewers. We're going to close out our second major argument, which, as you know, is that extrinsic considerations are often integral, often of the essence, to heterosexual sexuality. I'd like to propose just a couple of theoretically informed conjectures concerning the likely hypothetical impact on heterosexuality of eliminating or curtailing side payments from men to women. If we put together everything we've seen so far in this section, and we're honest with ourselves, we need to observe that side payments are not an aberration, but are rather of the essence to heterosexual sexuality. It would be tempting to imagine that eliminating resource transfers for sex, paying cash, paying for dates, performing costly favors, sharing income, would result in a world of free love and no charge sex. But the reality is very different. Most single women, during their long years of being single in modern society, to the extent they were persuaded at all to have casual sex, would focus their attention on the small portion of men who can excite their immediate interest, but to little effect. Essentially, women would end up taking a number and waiting. They would have long gaps while they awaited a hoped-for encounter with an elite male capable of impressing them solely on the basis of standalone characteristics. Most single men would be shut out altogether from casual sex and lead largely celibate and desperate lives. And so, the overall quantity and distribution of sex and its benefits for human life would be sharply curtailed. Given the centrality of side payments to the functioning of the heterosexual casual sex market, we really need to be thoughtful and cautious with any cultural or legal discouragement of such resource transfers. Of course, it would be wonderful for men and women to be more similar, and for heterosexuals to enjoy the same ease that gay men have in finding appealing and free casual encounters. However, as human heterosexuals, evolution has made us as men and women dissimilar in subtle and non-subtle ways. We need to live in this world and to be sensitive to the economic dimension of human sexual relations. And above all, to avoid undermining this market, to discourage it from clearing at a natural equilibrium. Because the implications of what you're seeing on this page, without getting into a great deal of technical detail, while they are dry and abstract and analytical, do not present a happy story. This has the clear potential to drain a tremendous part of the vitality, vigor, and well-being from the lives of so many people in Canada and societies universally. As we'll see in the next segment, we do need to act, but we cannot be ham-fisted about this in such an important sphere of human life. In this segment, we have argued at great length and in considerable detail that our species has evolved such that men and women are partially mismatched in our sexual quests. And as a result, human sexual encounters in both casual and romantic contexts are commonly facilitated explicitly or implicitly by favors and other resource transfers by men to women. Paid sexual services, in which men explicitly provide financial consideration to women for sex, are conceptually indistinct, economically, from much heterosexual sex. And so it would appear that any dictate that human sexual encounters be animated solely by carnal desire and physical sexual attraction would, were it to be consistently applied, profoundly disrupt the sex lives as actually lived of great swaths of humanity. Now that we have some perspective on sexual asymmetries and the ramifications for heterosexuality, it might be tempting for many men to ask whether there isn't an aspect of oppression and inequality in human sexuality as such. How could it be that men should generally need to transfer resources for something that is so integral to our well-being? From this perspective, shouldn't sex be as free as the air we breathe? Shouldn't women satisfy our deepest needs for free? But this complaint falls into the same category as a dog barking at the moon. Psychologically, there is no benefit as men to setting ourselves in opposition to a reality that has come to us through millions of years of evolution, and perhaps is even linked to our nature as mammals, the clad in which females invest disproportionately in offspring. That would link all of this to an epoch of more than 200 million years. In our individual lives as real men, the only cure is the erasure of our sexual needs with aging. In the meantime, we clearly need to maintain perspective. Obviously, we pay for food and for water, which are also necessary for our survival. And if we seek to live in harmony with our fundamental natures as human beings and with members of the opposite sex, we men need to accept this basic aspect of life. One way or another, sex with a desirable partner generally requires sharing resources. What we should absolutely not accept is a state telling us not to feed ourselves or to stop offering favors or resources to our lovers in sexual relationships. Nor should we accept the state telling to whom and under what conditions competent adult women should address their attentions. And we should be deeply skeptical of the implication of a part of the preamble to Bill C-36 that reads, quote, "Whereas it is important to protect the equality of all Canadians by discouraging prostitution," end quote. When we pause to reflect deeply about the origins and manifestations of sexual asymmetries and the ubiquity of resource transfers from men to women in human sexuality, we have to realize that this is not about equality or inequality in either direction. Those terms are as obtuse and unhelpful in this context as they would be applied to proposed legal remedies for the clearly unequal burden women bear in childbirth. Some things will not change. Men and women confront somewhat different sexual realities in this world, and from the anthropological evidence, they have, for millions of years, as humans and their predecessor species, been negotiating those differences in a finely choreographed dance of reciprocity, exchange, and connectedness. These are enduring realities that are beyond the reach of reductionist, overreaching statements of government lawyers. If you followed me all the way to this point in the segment, a big, big thanks. From here, we need to address in a nuanced and constructive fashion how casual sexual relations between men and women can be negotiated in a way that minimizes negative consequences, and above all for women. That's the topic to which we turn next during the next two segments. First, as we'll see, we need to confront openly what some of those consequences have been and their origins, so far as we can speculate. Thank you, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next part.